there was something else that was like intermingled with all the griefs that were being shared. It was a frustration and despair and a fatigue that there was yet another thing to grieve, that there were no breaks to be found between losses, and that as life continued to unfold, we as a society, as a collective, are very definitely looking at enduring many, many, many years of unpredictable, unavoidable grief down the road. In other words, and it hit me like a lightning bolt, people were grieving about grieving. And in that moment, I was like, is there a word for that? Is there a thing that exists to describe grieving about grieving? I could not find any words or definitions or articles about grieving, the grief experience itself. And so I created meta grief. Hi there, Grief Growers, and welcome back to Grief Grower. I am so honored to be spending time here with you today. If you have been growing alongside me in my work for a while, welcome back. And if you are new to me and my work, hello. My name is Shelby Forsythia. I'm a grief coach, a 2-time, soon-to-be 3-time author, and the founder of Life After Loss Academy, which is an online program that has helped dozens of grieving people stop feeling lost, stuck, heartbroken, and overwhelmed, and start building lives that they genuinely love from the lives that loss forced them to live. This, of course, not only includes death-related losses, which is what most people think of when they think about grief, but also losses like divorce and breakup, major diagnosis, and as you will hear on the show today, the losses of the world, and oftentimes grieving about grieving. Here on Grief Grower, we believe that grief is not something that we get over. It is something that we grow with and alongside, and that when we stop treating grief less like a problem to be solved and more like an invitation to live more deeply, we create meaningful lives that are rich with the memories that we carry, the struggles that we faced, and the precious awareness of what it means to be right here, right now. And as I hinted in the introduction to the show, today I want to share something that I invented with you, a new word, a new term for grief. It has sprung up for me out of not necessarily thin air, but after many months of thinking about it and pondering it, and then kind of this one moment in time activated, like this needs to be a thing, this needs to be a word in grief world right now. So the term that I have invented is called meta grief, and it essentially means to me, and we can build this definition together, I hope you'll write me and tell me what you think of this, grieving about grieving. There are things like meta-analysis, which is an analysis of analyses. There's meta-science, which is the science about science. And so to experience meta-grief is to experience grief about the grief experience itself. And so I'm calling this episode something akin to what is meta-grief, navigating things like grief fatigue, grief exhaustion, and the toll of ongoing tragedy. And I'll tell you the story of where this came from. I first started thinking about this term, or originated this term, in January of this year, which as soon as we had turned a new year, collectively, the news of the fires in Los Angeles here in the United States broke out everywhere. It was breaking news, and the fires and news about them and people grieving their homes and their possessions and their families and their jobs and their communities and their routines was just flooding my feed on Threads, which is one of the apps I spend quite a bit of time on. It's where I get my news these days. I'm calling it nice Twitter. It's Meta's version of Twitter. There are mean people there for sure, but it seems a little bit more vulnerable and honest than Twitter currently is, and a place where I enjoy getting back to some of my roots of just sharing written thoughts, which is a lot of where I started doing grief work, was sharing written thoughts without photos, without pictures on Facebook. And so Threads is where I spend a lot of my time, and I distinctly remember feeling like we were turning the corner from 2024 to 2025, and there's kind of always this collective hope for a fresh start or a new year that will somehow, even if it's just hope, be a little bit less griefy than the one that came before it, but tragedy burst in right away with this overwhelm and this great devastation. And as I was reading people's thoughts and experiences on threads, there was something else that was like intermingled with all the griefs that were being shared. It was a frustration and despair and a fatigue that there was yet another thing to grieve, that there were no breaks to be found between losses, and that as life continued to unfold, we as a society, as a collective, are very definitely looking at enduring many, many, many years of unpredictable, unavoidable grief down the road. In other words, and it hit me like a lightning bolt, people were grieving about grieving. And in that moment, as I was scrolling my Threads feed, I was like, is there a word for that? Is there a thing that exists to describe grieving about grieving? And so I Googled grieving about grief. But when I did, I got this list of articles, sort of the general kind that you think of after the death of a loved one, or when you're writing a research paper about the difference between grief and bereavement. And we already did a Grief Grower episode on that. It's episode 4 if you want to go back and listen to the difference between grief, loss, bereavement, and mourning, because they are all different words. But I could not find any words or definitions or articles about grieving, the grief experience itself. And so I created meta-grief. It is a noun, and it is the grief you feel about the fact that you're grieving, the experience of grief itself being a source of sorrow. And said another way, metagrief is an invisible load that adds another layer, often an unspoken layer, to an already heavy grief experience. And it is something that so many of us carry without even realizing it. It is something that originates in living inside of what we know to be an endless cycle of loss and trauma and heartbreak, both in our personal lives. We know that we're going to lose people or things or dreams or ideas in our life, and we also will experience greater collective losses as a society, as a world. It is grief about the ongoing nature of grief itself and a deep internal knowing that things like death and poverty and violence and oppression and disaster will always be a part of living and being a human on planet Earth. And becoming aware of metagrief looks like recognizing that you are not only mourning your loss, but you are also mourning the fact that you have to grieve in the first place. It is the distress or despair or resignation that comes from knowing that grief is going to be with you for the long haul, and that you will keep encountering grief even if you are not ready or willing to. I remember very distinctly a student in Life After Loss Academy described way back in 2020, she's like, I'm not necessarily mad about the fact that I'm grieving. I'm mad about this sense that it feels like grief was forced upon me. I did not choose this path. Grief is a full-time job. It's a full-time project. I'm having to expend energy that I already didn't have on something that I didn't ask to happen. And so now I am grieving, but I'm also grieving about the fact that I have to grieve, that I must, that it is an unavoidable part of being human and of processing all of my emotions about all the people that I have lost. And if this sounds anything like you, or if anything I've described about the concept of metagrief sounds like things you have been thinking about, I hope that you'll sort of ride along with me in this episode as I do my best to wrap words around this experience. And then absolutely, if this resonates with you, or if you have more to add, this is not the first time I want to be talking about metagrief. I do hope you will pop into the show notes of this episode and contact me and reach out with your thoughts on the concept of metagrief. So kind of to even keep going and drilling down into what exactly it means to be experiencing metagrief, see if any of these things sound familiar to you. Because in trying to pin down exactly what do I mean when I say metagrief or grieving about grieving, I've started to gather sentiments from students in Life After Loss Academy, from friends, family, coworkers, fellow grief professionals, and of course the original inspiration for this term, strangers expressing their grief on social media. So see if one or more of these sort of bullet point listicles resonates with you. 1, you are overwhelmed by the idea of grief, that it never fully ends, and has the potential to resurge again when you least expect it. 2, you are longing for the innocence and ease of a world before loss, and sometimes wish you could go back in time to an age where you did not know about or understand grief. Pre-grief nostalgia is what I'm calling this concept. Number 3, you dread the future, not necessarily because of what might happen, although that can be dread-inducing in and of itself, but because you know no matter what the losses are, there is always more grief waiting for you somewhere in the future. 4, you are exhausted by the unending process of grieving, resent the work it takes to process, and wish you could hit pause. But you know that ignoring your grief only makes things worse. And 5, you feel helpless and heartbroken witnessing world events, natural disasters, wars, political strife, violence, climate change, oppression, everything that reminds you of the fragility of life and the endless reasons each and every one of us has to mourn. And kind of from what I've seen and what I've gathered from everywhere I have access to and can hold in this present moment, knowing that I am human just like everybody else, these 5 things form the heart and the essence of meta grief. Meta grief is not necessarily about the loss itself. It's not necessarily someone I love died, or I got a divorce, or a major diagnosis changed my life, or my home is on fire. It is more about how you feel about having to grieve the loss in the first place. It is the weight of knowing that grief is hardwired inescapably into the human experience and that it does not have an end point. And if everything I'm saying feels like a lot to you, that's because it is. And meta grief is something, just like so many other aspects of grief, that has a ton of layers. And it shows up differently for different people, but here's some common ways I have seen it show up. One of the biggest ones is grieving loss of innocence. And as I mentioned before, this is a concept I'm calling pre-grief nostalgia. It is this ache or this wish or this desire or this longing, like a very physical felt in your chest emotion, to go back to a time when you did not even know when grief was. Some of us do not have the luxury of not knowing grief. Some of us are born into grief or oppression or violence or strife. Some of us have the luxury or the privilege of having and remembering life pre-loss, or knowing that bad things happened somewhere out there, but they had not touched us yet. And so there's this sense of, I wish I could go back there. And even if you were a person who did not have that privilege and were born into a life where grief was inherently part of your story, you may long for a kind of like an alternative timeline, a pre-grief nostalgia of a life that could have been had you not been born into griefy or traumatic circumstances. This can also look like looking around at people who have not yet experienced profound loss and feeling envy or jealousy or anger towards them, and this ability that they have to live without the shadow or the awareness of grief as their constant companion. And you might also be pissed at people who know that grief exists and yet willingly ignore it. These are people who are ignorance is bliss types, or look on the bright side, toxic positivity types. I have to say, on many past podcast episodes, both on my own shows and others where I've been interviewed, I often refer to grief's appearance in our lives as a perspective-shifting event. It is a worldview-changing event. Once you see grief or experience grief, you can't unsee or unexperience it. Once you know, you can't unknow. And in Life After Loss Academy, I often describe living with grief as having a pair of grief glasses permanently superglued to your face. You can no longer not see through the lens of grief. I know that's a double negative, but in other words, once grief first makes an appearance in your life, you never know a life without grief again. You start to see it not just in your life, but in the lives of people surrounding you, or in movies or music or television or media or radio. You start to just notice grief themes everywhere and connect with grief in lots of different ways. On one hand, that can make you extraordinarily compassionate and empathetic and human. And on another hand, it can feel very much as if grief is an inescapable force or presence. And one big part of meta grief is mourning this loss of the life before the grief goggles or the grief glasses, the version of you that had no idea how heavy and lifelong the experience of grief is. Okay, another way that meta grief can manifest for people is dreading future losses. Even when you're not in the devastating early days of grief, you might notice yourself bracing for, or like holding your breath for, the next loss, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Meta grief can appear as anticipatory grief, the knowledge that grief isn't a one-time event, but something you face again and again in different forms and iterations, and kind of preparing for the next loss. So, for instance, you might be grieving the death of a loved one right now, but you know that others you love will die in the future. You may dread the day a beloved pet dies, the day you're forced to leave a job you love or can no longer do it physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, the day you or a loved one receives a life-changing diagnosis that alters how you see or perceive of your health or your body forever. You might dread the day you and a partner one day separate, or the day that your community or your country faces a collective tragedy or disaster. The meta grief, the grief about grief, of anticipating future losses is exhausting. I cannot convey to you, if you have this, you already know it, how exhausting it is, because it's something that takes you out of the present moment and suspends you in this constant state of tension and holding your breath and waiting for the other shoe to drop, thinking about and considering what might come next. And while it's factually true that you'll face more losses, the lived experience of prepping for future losses is a grief about grief that so many of us feel. It's a fear that many of us have, but it is not often talked about. And I will say, because you've lived through it before, you know intimately just how deep and destabilizing loss can be. So the anticipation you feel is not abstract panic. You are not freaking out over nothing. You are not waiting for that shoe to drop for no reason. It is grounded in your past experience. So I want to validate that dreading future losses is a very normal part of grieving about grief. It is not something that's irrational or crazy or overblown. You know personally from intimate lived experience that more losses can happen. And that is something that we are not talking about, that we really need to be. And this is why so much I'm trying to wrap this phrase or this term of meta grief, grieving about grieving, around this experience. One of the other ways that meta grief can manifest is feeling stuck in a cycle of grief. And this can often happen when one loss seems to follow another loss, or when they're all like piled on top of each other. It is extraordinarily easy to feel like you're trapped in this never-ending cycle of grief. And this flavor of meta grief, grieving about grieving, is about the weariness of grieving itself. It's this desire to like move forward or get out of the mud of grief, but you feel like grief keeps pulling you back, or like snap back like a rubber band. And one of my students in Life After Loss Academy, I'll never forget this, she and I began calling this feeling grief debt. And it's this sense that we will always owe some form of emotional, physical, mental, or spiritual processing time to grief. We are in debt to the experience of grief. It is a feeling that stacks up and compounds with each new loss, because more loss equals more grief to process. And it can feel like, especially if you have a bunch of losses all together, that you're in a never-ending game of catch-up with grief. And the example I can give you of this from my own life is my best friend dying from COVID in 2022, while the larger world was still reeling from the early years of the pandemic and the social and political upheaval that came with that. So those two things were happening in tandem. And then 1 month after she died, I was diagnosed with a chronic illness that changed my life and began a brand new grieving process for the health and the body and frankly the hair that I used to have. I had barely started to grieve my best friend. I was less than 30 days in to her death, and was caught up in the grief of the United States and the larger world when this fresh new loss arrived. And it was like watching my grief bank balance, my metaphorical bank balance, dip from the negative hundreds of thousands into the negative millions. And there was nothing that I could do to prevent it. It was like, oh my gosh, I have even more grief to catch up on, even more than was already on my plate. That's another way that meta grief can manifest. And so if you are feeling this right now, you are absolutely not alone. The fourth way that meta grief can often manifest, and I kind of referred to this in the last one, is mourning on behalf of the world. And this is one that so many clients, students, friends, people in my life who are neurodivergent or highly sensitive or empathetic or compassionate or just kind of natural caregivers, this is one that they feel very, very deeply, because the world feels really heavy right now. War, climate disasters, violence, systemic oppression, all of this adds to the personal griefs and losses that we all carry. And meta grief, one way it can look, is mourning for people that you've never met and mourning for places that you've never been, simply because you notice and feel the weight of the world's suffering. And of course, our 24-hour news cycle, which gets more views and clicks on negative, heavy air quotes, stories than it does on positive ones, only intensifies this feeling of being stuck in a continuous cycle of loss and grieving on behalf of the world. Whether you are watching children be separated from their parents at the border, or hearing about families being torn apart or being lost by violence in war zones, or witnessing the overturning of policies designed to protect marginalized people, or keeping tabs on the latest hurricane or tornado or flood or fire, it is a lot. It is a lot on every level to contend with. And wrapped up in all of this can often be a belief that you have no right to grieve your personal losses when there is so much going on in the world. It is the terrible, you better finish everything on your plate because there are children starving in Africa. You cannot suffer because people are suffering worse. And that your individual grief has no place among the collective, and nothing can be further from the truth. The other side of that is you may grieve that you need to tune out the pain of the world in order to tend to your own personal pain. You may have dropped off the face of the earth when it comes to keeping up with the news. You may feel as if you have no idea what's going on in the world because the crisis in your home, in your own grief experience, is so painful and so overwhelming. And either way, whether you're thinking, I have no right to complain about my suffering because everybody else has it so much worse, or I've tuned out the world's suffering because mine is so great, it all feels like grieving about grieving. I am grieving the fact that I have to even make this choice. It is a recognition that you are just one human being, and it is impossible to hold all of these griefs together in one person all at once. The next one I want to talk about, a way that metagrief manifests, is one that I see a lot, especially when it comes to social issues, economic issues, climate issues, political issues. And this is the grief that some or all of this loss and suffering could have been prevented. And this is one that we do not have language for, which is why I'm really trying to get this language of metagrief out there, because this specific type of metagrief that many people seem to feel has this tinge of if only. It's a belief that if something had gone differently, then our grief would not be so big, or we would not have to grieve something at all. It is the knowledge that in some cases, human decisions led to a very real and felt increase in pain and suffering and heartache and grief. This can be applied to personal losses, such as a suffering-filled decline of a loved one, a divorce process that went on way too long, a diagnosis that you got late in life and you feel like I missed out on so much life, it did not have to be this way, I wish I'd gotten this diagnosis sooner, or a delayed exit from a toxic friendship or relationship or job. But it can also be applied to something like communal or world losses, such as pandemic deaths, policy-related losses, things like immigration or reproductive rights, also things like climate change, or involvement in or ignoring of war. And regardless of whether the loss is personal or communal, the lingering story is it didn't have to be this way. This didn't have to be the path that we chose. There were other paths and choices that we could have taken, that we could have made, ones with less suffering. This type of pain, this flavor of pain, did not have to be our burden, and yet here we are. You are grieving about the fact that you must grieve the present reality as it is right now. And to be very clear, it is not regret. Regret is, I chose wrong and I wish I could go back and choose again. This sense of this could have gone differently is a profound sense of deep disappointment. That if people or circumstances, usually ones that are outside of our control, could have been different, could have acted differently, done differently, responded sooner, then maybe everyone's suffering could either be lessened or would not exist at all. It is an imaginary sort of torture to say if only it had gone this way, we would not be grieving this way. But it is also very grounded in reality that many times our human decisions, whether on a personal or collective level, or circumstances outside of our control, if either of those things had gone differently, then this grief may not have even presented itself in the first place. And that is a very specific kind of grieving about grief. The last one I want to touch on, the final manifestation that I've uncovered about grief, is simply, it's the most obvious. It is grieving the grief journey itself. Because grief requires a hell of a lot from us. It demands that we sit with discomfort and process complicated emotions and revisit memories that feel more painful than comforting. Meta-grief, grieving about grieving, is the exhaustion of knowing that grief is an inherent part of being human and that we must grieve in order to survive. There is no shortcut through grief. There is no path around, under, over, through. There is no magic pill, and there is no easy way out of the experience of grief. And I will say, many grief experts, including myself, including all of us here on Grief Grower, every single episode, we talk about the benefits of seeing grief as a long-term relationship. There is another side to that coin, the dark side. And that is, if I see grief as a long-term relationship, I acknowledge that grief is never ending. So whether you're making plans or celebrating a milestone or dealing with life's inconveniences or working towards your dreams, grief is a part of the picture. And no matter how quote-unquote good you get at grief, you will always be grieving, and there will always be more to grieve. And even joy comes with echoes and callbacks to loss, people who aren't here to share things with you, the versions of yourself or the world that existed before this experience of grief entered the picture. There are so many griefs embedded in the grief journey, including this fact that grief never goes away, it is never ending, the reality that society often demands you hide or suppress your grief in order to be quote-unquote a functioning person, grieving the person that you really want to process your grief with, whether they've died or it's a breakup situation, and the inherent unpredictability of how grief shows up day to day. Now, grief growers, this is a lot. This is a lot. And I don't want to leave you on a bummer note. I want to convey and introduce you to this new word I have invented for grief. But as we come to the end of this episode, I want to offer some ways for how to cope with meta grief, grieving about grieving, because it's hard. This is such a hard thing. And if you are recognizing yourself all throughout this episode, then you know that my next step for you is going to be to offer some ways to deal with it, process it, cope with it, work with it. And so the first one I want to offer to you is acknowledge it out loud. Say, I'm grieving about my grief. I'm experiencing meta grief. I am feeling grief over the fact that I am grieving. While it might feel strange to say that, it is a very powerful way to validate your emotions. And if you have someone you are grieving with or alongside, friend, family member, coworker, neighbor, grief support professional, consider acknowledging your meta grief with them or sharing the concept of meta grief with them and say, we're grieving about the fact that we are grieving. You might even laugh about it. This can provide space and room for both validation and noticing, oh, we are not alone. We are all grieving about grieving right now. The second thing that I want to offer you is to take breaks from grief. I know I've said before that grieving people are grievers 24/7, and we are all in long-term relationships with our grief. But there is a big difference between actively engaging with your grief, things like journaling, moving your body, crying, talking about it, and so on, and allowing yourself to simply exist in the world as a grieving person. So as much as you can, give yourself permission to take breaks from actively processing your grief. You do not have to be doing grief work all the time. This is a huge pressure that I put on myself, especially after my mom's death, is in order to get over my grief, I have to be doing grief work all the time. And that burned me out. That was really hard to do. So things like taking a break from your grief might look like watching funny movies, spending time in nature, doing anything that brings you joy or silliness or play or an escape from the experience of working through your grief 24/7. You do not have to be immersed in that kind of heavy, hard, and heart work all the time in order to honor your losses or to prove that you care about your loved one who died or even to heal. There is a lot of healing that can happen from experiencing other things while you are also simply existing in the world as a grieving person. And I will say, if you have the time, money, and energy, you might even take a vacation or a griefcation or a vacation that honors your grief to really step away from the experience of living grief day to day. Or you might do like a social media sabbatical or a news sabbatical or something of that nature to unplug as much as possible from things that feel like they're piling on grief, to say, what are some things I can do to pile off grief or to set grief on the back burner for a little bit so I can play or rest or be creative or spend time with things that nourish me. The third thing I want to offer you for coping with meta grief is building a routine to your day that is grief inclusive. So this looks like creating regular rituals that make space for your grief while also allowing you to live your life. Things like writing or meditation or yoga or going on short walks. These are all things that can help you find the balance between mourning and being immersed in despair and feeling like you are able to grow into the future. One example that I will give, I'll call back to my best friend's death, is I regularly listen to a podcast that we used to listen to together when she was alive. And while she's not here in person or on planet Earth to listen with me, in listening to this podcast, and it's usually very funny, it is not a deep or heavy podcast most of the time, I like to imagine in my head what she might say in response to the hosts and picture her laughing with me at parts that I know she would find funny. And it is one way that I fold my grief for her and my relationship to her into my regular routine. And it is also a way I infuse my grief with like a bit of lightness. It's not all hard grief work. It's not all EMDR trauma therapy. It is not all writing about how much I miss her or talking about the way my heart aches with family and friends. That is part of it. But it is also folding in things that remind me of her in funny or joyful or silly ways. And other things you might do if that's not something that resonates with you is incorporating grief books or podcasts like this one or online courses into your regular life. These resources can help you have more language for talking about grief and also reassure you that you are not the only one on planet Earth who is noticing and bearing witness to the heaviness of the world. And one of the things I always recommend in spots like this is if you are grieving the death of a loved one, in addition to experiencing meta grief or grieving about grieving, my second book, Your Grief Your Way, is a very good place to start. It is a short, non-religious daily devotional for living life after a person you care about dies. And it has teeny tiny little passages. I think they're all 250 words or less. And they're written out by the days of the year. You can start literally anytime. You don't have to follow along January, February, March, April, and so on. You can skip around, you can play book roulette and flip open to any page and just see what resonates with you. And they're kind of ping-pong sistered passages. Some days are quotes and some days are exercises that you can do to move through and cope with your grief. And it is a massive coping tool that is used in many places around the world right now to help people feel like they have a small routine to devote to their grief. And it takes less than 10 minutes a day. For some people, 5 minutes a day if you're a fast reader, to read the passage, sort of absorb the message, and then go on with your day. The fourth thing I want to offer you for coping with meta grief is finding community, because the more I talk about it, the more I realize that meta grief is something a lot of people feel. Grieving, we are all grieving about grieving. So seeking out spaces where you can connect with other people who understand, whether it is support groups, online forums, trusted friends, is paramount. Of course, this is where I'll put in a plug for Life After Loss Academy. This is my community online, which is created intentionally for all kinds of losses. I call them the 3Ds and more: death, divorce, diagnosis, and more. Every single week, we are coming together as a group to chat about and honor both our personal losses, the things that oftentimes brought us to the group, but also the ways that society and the world that we live in are shaping our grief experience at the same time. So if you are interested in talking about meta grief with a group of compassionate and validating grievers, I hope you'll consider joining us, and you can find the link to do that in the show notes. The last one I want to offer you, number 5, when coping with meta grief, is to shift your perspective, and this is easier said than done. Grief, including meta grief, is not something to conquer or get rid of. This is the core message at the heart of Grief Grower. Grief is not something to get over. It is something we carry with us through the rest of our lives. And seeing grief not as something to hurry up and get over, but as a constant sort of ebbing and flowing presence in your life can help you anticipate its presence, build up a tolerance for it, and perhaps even welcome its perspective in your life at times. And I tell students in Life After Loss Academy, clients I work with, that with time, attention, patience, and practice, grief can begin to feel like less of a burden and more like a companion, one that shapes you. Yes, absolutely, grief has an influence on your life and the course of your life in meaningful ways, but not one that necessarily hinders you or keeps you from living, or is so full of despair that you do not feel able to go on. There are many, many kinds of relationships that we can have with grief, and sometimes just seeing it through a slightly different lens can help us not necessarily, throw open the doors and welcome to the party grief, but say, okay, grief's in the room, and I have tools, and I have words, and I have the ability to sit with it and to tend to it in the way that it deserves, and frankly, in the way that I deserve. The thing I want to close with at the end of the show today is that you are allowed to grieve about grief. Meta grief, or grieving about grieving, is a natural and normal response to the complexities of being a person on planet Earth. It is more than okay to grieve about grieving, to feel tired of carrying loss, and to mourn the fact that grief is an inevitable part of life. The good news is that you do not have to carry meta grief all by yourself. Whether you are grieving a personal loss or the weight of the world or both, there are tools and communities to help you navigate this invisible weight of meta grief and to help you find the language for describing these specific flavors of grieving about grief. So I would love to hear from you. Do you think that meta grief is an appropriate term for grieving about grieving? Please get in touch through the link in the show notes and let me know. And of course, if you would like to keep the conversation going, if you would like more intimate access to me and to a community of wonderfully compassionate grievers, I hope you'll join us inside Life After Loss Academy, which is my online grief support course and community. Once again, every single week we meet to talk about grief's presence in our lives. I share tools for coping with it, and we also talk about how we're finding stability and hope and purpose in a world that is griefier and griefier by the day. And the replays of these conversations are available to watch anytime if you can't attend live. And in case you didn't hear it on past episodes of Grief Grower, discounted memberships are available if you're a marginalized or a financially stressed griever, and you can learn more and join us at the link in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining me today to explore this concept of meta grief, and I look forward to hearing what you think of this new term to describe what it means to grieve about grieving. That's all for this episode of Grief Grower. Thank you so very much for joining me today. If you're looking for grief support beyond this show, you can find free workshops, blog articles, and my signature What's Your Grief Support Style quiz at shelbyforsythia.com/links. And if you'd like to get support from me for your unique loss experience, do join us in Life After Loss Academy, my online course and community. As a student, I will walk you through my 5-step grief framework, GRIEF, for rebuilding after loss, and you can get live coaching from me every single week to answer your questions. Once again, replays are always available if you can't attend live, and it's just $33 a month to join or $22 a month if you're a marginalized or financially stressed griever. If this podcast felt validating, comforting, educational, or otherwise helpful to you, please subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And be sure to share Grief Grower with a friend, because you never know what someone you love is going through or any of the griefs that they're grieving about. Grief Grower is hosted by me, Shelby Forsythia, and the theme music is composed by Addie Goldstein. Until next time, Grief Growers, I see you. I am so proud of you and the work that you're doing in the world. And I love you. Because even through grief, we are growing.